Hello, and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 7 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, How the Adventure Ended.
This has also been a very good chapter.
You're really enjoying these, okay?
Yeah.
Good.
And you said earlier that you enjoyed this one particularly as well.
This is a pretty important chapter.
It is very rich in metaphorical content.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most famous chapter of the book. I feel like what happens here with Eustace and Aslan, spoiler alert, Aslan shows up, I think is probably pretty well known even outside of the Narnian Chronicles. I mean, I feel like I hear people use this example of what's going to happen with the dragon and Aslan often, even outside of our small world of Narnia lovers. So yeah. It's a really great passage here, a really great chapter in general, but especially this baptism of Eustace, if you will, is pretty important in the entire canon of Narnia. So you want to jump into it?
Let's go.
Do you have any, before we actually get started, I should have asked you, anything we got to fix from last time?
Nope.
It was perfect. We've been on a roll. There's
no
mistakes.
We have finally achieved perfection.
You know what's funny is that I don't even do any editing to the podcast anymore. This is exactly what it sounds like. We don't make any mistakes.
It's just easier to not make mistakes.
That's a lot easier. I know.
That's why I write in pen.
Well, in the last episode in Chapter 6, Eustace woke up to the startling discovery that he had become a dragon. And he wasn't too happy about it, was he?
He was not.
And the chapter ended on a little bit of a cliffhanger, although I don't know if it was a cliffhanger. It just ended in the middle of a conversation.
It did, and it was a real page turner because you were curious why they were looking at the bracelet.
Yeah, it was an odd thing, but here we are with Chapter 7. So I've got my chapter summary. Are you ready to go?
Let's hear it.
Caspian and his crew discovered that the dragon on the beach is Eustace, who is unable to explain how he came to be the creature. Over the next few days, Eustace uses his new body to help the crew of the Dawn Treader. He provides food and warmth to the crew, as well as a new mast for the ship. During this time, he is comforted with stories from Reepicheep. One morning, Edmund is surprised to find a human Eustace walking towards the camp. Eustace tells Edmund the story of his undragoning. He explains how Aslan appeared to him and brought him to a pool of water. After several unsuccessful attempts of peeling off his own skin, Eustace allows Aslan to help. The pain is tremendous, but eventually Eustace enters the pool and transforms back into a boy. Caspian names the island Dragon Island, and the Dawn Treader sets sail.
Well done. What is that, 149 characters?
It was 150 exactly.
150?
Yeah,
exactly.
I had a lot more.
A couple seasons ago, we were doing 142 to 147, but now it's 150 every time.
Almost. I mean, we've talked about this a little bit.
It's just more content.
There's more stuff in these chapters. There definitely is than way back to the wardrobe. There was a lot less, not like that it was worse, but there was less happening for sure.
Yeah.
Initial reaction, Phil. What do you have from this chapter?
The whole process of Aslan removing his dragon body and restoring him, I was very immersed in that scene, and I am so grateful that it was written this way. And it just gives you yet another way to think about what Christ has done for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your initial reactions?
My big takeaway, and I've never noticed this before until I was studying and preparing for recording this episode, is the prominence that stories play in this chapter. So 3 specific times Lewis mentions stories. The first one is that Eustace didn't know any of the right books, and so he couldn't really tell the story well of his becoming the dragon as a dragon. He tries to write it out a couple of times, he can't do it.
Right. And
then later on in the chapter, as he's being comforted by Reepicheep, Reepicheep is using stories to kind of tell him, look, this happens sometimes, and it's going to be okay. So he uses stories to encourage him.
And it's a plethora of stories as well. Exactly.
And then lastly, after Eustace I love the way he's undragoned, right?
Yeah.
After he is undragoned, that doesn't happen in real time. Interestingly enough, we have Eustace appear after this transformation, and he tells a story about meeting Aslan to Edmund. So it's not like that happens in real time. It's a story. And even he mentioned specifically, he doesn't even want to tell the story of how he became the dragon. He just wants to tell the story of how he became undragoned. And so Lewis, multiple times throughout this chapter, uses story as a positive way of communicating something. I mean, that's what story is, right? But I think he's very particular in the way that he has shaped this small little chapter, although it's full of many things, into the role that stories can play in our lives. And I want to explore that a little bit as we go through this, but that really stuck out to me, the prominence of story.
And he's telling us a story that is very familiar, at least if you've grown up in the church, but he's telling it in a different way that gives you a different perspective on the story you've already heard.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the chapter. So chapter 7 begins with Eustace, with the rest of the crew finding out that Eustace is the dragon. What's going on there, Phil?
So they're talking to the dragon, and they're trying to find out who he is. They think he might be Lord Octesian. Lord Octesian. And luckily, Eustace is still able to understand them and nod and shake his head, which I think would be hilarious because he's so much larger than the people.
Well, I can't wait till you see the movie.
Yeah.
It's very hilarious.
I'm actually...
But not in a good way.
Not in a good way. Oh, man. I was excited to see how they did it, but...
It's still fun.
Yeah. So once everyone finds out that it is Eustace, the reaction is, man, that's a real bummer. And they console him by saying, hey, I'm sure there's a way to reverse it and we'll figure it out. But they're really not sure what to do in the meantime.
Oh, yeah.
And he ends up being really helpful, which is great. Because I think he recognizes that he's been a real bother to everybody. And now he's even more of a bother, but he wants to help out. So he starts carrying things and helping load up the ship. Mm-hmm. He goes and he kills goats and brings back the carcasses for them to eat. He has a few for himself. And then he also gives people rides, or
which is so fun.
I love the way he says it. He takes them on a fly. Like, instead of going for a nice drive, you go for a nice fly.
And he takes those away. Doesn't he take the goats away and he eats them raw? And he's courteous enough to not do that in front of the others.
He doesn't want everyone to see that.
Do you think here? Let's actually talk about this for a second. Is he eating these goats far away from everyone else because he is self-conscious of eating them like a dragon, or is he trying to be respectful of the others? Which one's happening right now?
I believe it's both, but it's mainly he's embarrassed.
He's embarrassed. This is not...
He's a pretty proper person.
That's true, yeah. And I don't think this transformation that's happened to him internally has fully happened at this point. I think it's happening, but I don't think he's just, I'm going to be nice and not eat raw goat in front of them, which is nice. You don't usually want your friends to eat raw goat in front of you.
I have the same policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's why you and I don't eat dinner together usually.
Yeah, especially raw goat.
During this kind of sequence of events, as Eustace, ooh, it's tough.
Yeah.
As Eustace is helping the rest of the crew, Lewis writes this sentence, which is pretty important here. The pleasure, quite new to him, of being liked, and still more of liking other people, was what kept Eustace from despair. So Eustace, who has been quite the misanthrope throughout this book, as he has become more separated than he's ever been from the crew of the Dawn Treader, it's now here that he most needs them and most wants to be closer to them. I mean, that's pretty easy stuff to understand, but I do think that this is so important for his character. Phil, any other things that stand out to you before we get into the real meat of this chapter? Here, as he is still a dragon, anything that stands out to you?
He's given a sense of hope by Reepicheep.
Yeah.
And Reepicheep says, hey, this has happened lots of times before, but many had recovered and lived happily ever afterwards. And I think that probably helps him keep going. Why do you think
Reepicheep reaches out to him like this?
Reepicheep is a true gentleman mouse in a really good way. He's very fair, but he isn't going to put up with stuff, but he also recognizes that you need to treat people with respect. And I think he's living out the treat people how you would want to be treated part.
Yeah, he's very selfless. Lewis tells us that he steps away, but steps away from the rest of the group. When they're at the campfire and stuff like that, he would creep away from the merry circle at the campfire and sit down by the dragon's head. And the thing that's funny about this is this could potentially hurt him. Lewis says he has to be well to the windward to be out of the way of his smoky breath. Reepicheep's very small.
Yeah.
And Eustace, as a dragon, is very large. And Reepicheep still goes out of his way to minister, to comfort Eustace. And I think this is a key part of Eustace's transformation, is this kind of simple charity that Reepicheep offers him, right? But then right before Eustace returns, Lewis does give us this one other sentence, which I want to hear your thoughts on, Phil. He writes this: "And poor Eustace realized more and more that since the first day he came on board, he had been an unmitigated nuisance, and that he was now a greater nuisance still."
My question there was, how did he realize that he had been a nuisance? It makes sense where he recognizes he's being a nuisance now because they can't fit him on the ship and that he's delaying their plans. But does he overhear people talking with his dragon ears about how he used to be, or is he just recognizing it because now he can see it in physical form?
No, I don't think that's it. I think that's a good idea, but at least my takeaway was that Eustace is now seeing all of his problems be magnified. Right? Before, he was a nuisance. I mean, that's the word that Lewis uses to the ship, right? All of them were bothered by him and annoyed by him. But it mostly flew under the radar for Eustace. And it's not until he literally is too big to fit on the ship and they're actually have some large problems other than he's just annoying them, that he actually experiences what it's like to be a burden to someone. I don't think he's ever felt this before. Yeah. But I think he can't really deny it because the problem has become so magnified at this point. He realizes, oh, I don't fit on the Dawn Treader, or well, when we leave, how are they going to feed me? And this is an actual problem. And now that problem has become so large, he can't deny it. And so for the first time in his life, he's actually feeling or realizing that he's a burden to other people. And then once that feeling has creeped into his heart, into his head, he's like, wait a second. I think maybe it's been like this for so long, but that problem has to be magnified in order for him to realize it.
Yep. And I've been there too, where you recognize. Have you
been a dragon before?
Yeah, have you not?
Nope, I have not.
I've been in a place where you recognize that something you're doing is not being well received, and then you wonder, well, how long has this been going on?
Oh yeah,
and that's not a good feeling either.
It's the worst feeling, right? Yeah. And you go back and you think through so many things. I mean, I think we all can empathize with Eustace here because we've all done. I mean, have you ever left? Maybe you haven't felt this way. I know sometimes we'll leave a party or something, and I'll turn to Anna and I'll be like, "Was I annoying? Was I too loud or too obnoxious or something?" And the times when you start to recognize, like, maybe I was not the best person that I could be, or maybe I was kind of gossiping or something, You're speaking unkindly, you start to play back, and when there is some kind of revelation of, actually, I don't think that was helpful or that was kind, you start kind of playing back stuff in your head. And sometimes it can become very unhelpful, but there's other times where it can be helpful, not to sit and wallow in shame or guilt, but to recognize, oh, wait, that's what was really happening. And now I can try to get rid of, try to avoid that in the future. And I think that's what's happening to Eustace. I think it's good on him that he doesn't just sit and wallow in the shame of all of his past actions, which he easily could. Yeah. Well, then 6 days pass. They've been on Dragon Island for 6 days, and Edmund is sleeping one morning, and he wakes up to see Eustace coming out from between the trees. Hey, what's Eustace tell him?
So Eustace tells Edmund, "Hey, it's me. I'm not a dragon anymore. Can we go talk? I want to tell you what led to me no longer being a dragon." And he also, this is a great technique by Lewis. He says, "I don't even want to tell you how I became a dragon." Now we don't have to hear that part again.
Yeah.
Because he could very easily summarize it, but he wants to get to the real part, which is how he's no longer a dragon. And I think that when people share their testimony, it is helpful to know who they were, but we don't necessarily need to find out how they became who they were. We want to find out the real cool part, which is how they became who they are today after being saved.
Yeah. And Edmund allows him to do this. He says, "Fire away." And I think this is great. I love when Lewis does this, or any author does this. When Lewis was writing Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he did not know he was going to be writing Dawn Treader. He might have had inklings of, nice. I didn't mean to do that. He might have had some inklings of ideas for the future, but it's not like these were all planned out in advance. And it's kind of like he realizes he has two great, toys in the sandbox, if you will, and realizing, oh, these would go really well together, because how great is it that Eustace comes to Edmund, of all people, to share this story?
Yeah. And Edmund is willing to hear it because he has a similar story.
Exactly. And I think Edmund receives this better than anyone else would have. I mean, Lucy has been so patient and kind to Eustace throughout the book, but I don't think she would have responded the same way that Edmund does. I mean, Edmund, at the end of this, I know we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but Edmund's response is like, I was way worse than you. Like, I was a traitor. And we talked about this I think when Sarah Jane was on a couple chapters ago, of how I still think that Edmund's, his sin is worse than, in a way, his wrongdoings are worse because he knows all along that it's wrong. Eustace is just ignorant. And I mean, there's good and bad parts of both of those, but it's a very different approach to their actions. Eustace really, until becoming the dragon, doesn't realize I'm the bad guy, And so I love the patience and the grace with which Edmund receives this story from Eustace.
Me too.
So let's jump into the story, right?
So Eustace is in dragon form at this point, and he sees a lion.
He's in dragon form.
He's
I
in
like
dragon
that.
form.
Yeah.
He's dragoned.
Mm-hmm.
He's not undragoned yet. He sees Aslan. He doesn't know it's Aslan. He sees a lion, and he thinks he's afraid, but he also, I think the thought went through his head, could I take on a lion? I am a dragon right now.
Mm-hmm.
But he's afraid for seemingly a different reason. And then also the lion tells him to follow him, but it also doesn't necessarily say it out loud, which is very interesting. I'm curious how he perceived that he needed to follow him. So he starts following him, and then they go to a pool. You want to take it from there?
So Aslan has, this light shining about him, and he leads Eustace to a pool of water. And it says the water is bubbling up from the bottom of it. It's bigger than most wells. And somehow Aslan tells him he needs to undress, even though Eustace isn't really sure that's exactly how it was communicated. He does know this within himself.
Yeah.
And so then here's what C.S. Lewis writes. Well, and this is Eustace talking. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on when I suddenly thought that dragons are snaky sort of things and snakes can cast their skins. Oh, of course, thought I, that's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper and instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully like it does after an illness or as if I was a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bath. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and saw that they were all hard and rough and wrinkled and scaly just as they had been before. Oh, that's all right, said I. It only means I have another, smaller suit on underneath the first one, and I'll have to get out of it too. So I scratched and tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully, and out I stepped and left it lying beside the other one and went down to the well for my bath. Well, exactly the same thing happened again. And I thought to myself, oh dear, however many skins have I got to take off? And Eustace goes on to talk about how he longs to have this off, but he just can't do it. This is a pretty important passage.
It is. And then Aslan tells him that he's going to have to do it. Aslan himself.
Yeah.
I'll read that part too. Then the lion said, but I don't know if it spoke. You will have to let me undress you. I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you. But I was pretty near desperate now. So I just lay down flat on my back and let him do it. The first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. You know, if you've ever picked the scab off a sore place, it hurts like Billy O, but it is fun to see it coming away. And then Edmund goes, I know exactly what you mean.
And Edmund does know exactly what he means.
Because he's had a similar experience.
Yeah.
I don't know what Billy O means, but I'm assuming it hurts.
I think he wrote The Piano Man. I feel like that's one of your jokes. Sorry.
That's good.
Well, wow. This is a powerful passage.
The part where he says, I thought it had gone right into my heart. My note is, because it did.
Let's talk about this here because there's so much imagery. There's so much metaphor here. And again, this is probably one of the most famous passages within all 7 books. And I honestly don't even know where to start because I have so many things I want to talk about here.
Well, you also said it was popular, and I assume that means that a lot of people have written about it.
Yeah, that's true. I actually have pulled quite a few different things from different people. I mean, I even remember hearing about it, and our head of school at work has done some. Sometimes at chapel has talked about this passage because many of our kids read Chronicles of Narnia. I remember hearing about it in sermons growing up, and then I just feel like it comes out so often because it's such a beautiful example that many of us can relate to, despite the fact that I don't think you and I haven't, and I don't think any of our listeners have been dragons before, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I guess where we'll start is this idea that Eustace goes down to the water and he has to take off his dragon skin, and he does actually do it. He does it multiple times, but for some reason it doesn't stick. As soon as he makes it down to the water, he realizes it's still there, and it's not until he submits to Aslan that he's able to really actually get this off. Right? It's painful. It hurts. It's not the same as when he's trying to fix this skin himself. And this is easily like in our own lives with sin, with the things that we need to be freed of, right?
Yeah.
Father David Poking, I think I'm saying his name right, he's a Catholic priest, and he actually writes this in response to this section. He says, "To heal us, to perfect us, the Lord Jesus is willing to dig more deeply into us than we would ever dig into ourselves. Where we might gloss, well, at least I didn't murder anyone this week, at least I didn't commit adultery, he judges our every angry word tantamount to murder, our every lustful thought tantamount to adultery." So pulling right there from the Sermon on the Mount. And he goes on to say this, "And even if my own conscience is so dulled that I still discern in my soul no sins of commission, there are always the sins of omission. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." He's quoting directly from the Gospels. "Love one another as I have loved you." Again, another quote from the Gospels. I mean, this is big, right? And that's, by the way, I'll post that. It's from a article about Christ tears off our scales, Aslan, Eustace, and the pain of confession. And so that's, I mean, one of the big takeaways is this idea that we cannot fix the broken things within ourselves. We are not able to make that kind of transformation. We can do small things, but we don't.
And temporary things.
Exactly. But when we really need to finally go to that water to get clean, we don't have it within us.
Yeah, can't do it.
To take that a step further, Marvin Hinton, he writes this: "Eustace first scratches off his scales or sins, and then his whole skin or sinful self. Despite several sheddings of skin, however, he is unable to change himself, therefore making one of Lewis's favorite theological points from his adult nonfiction, that Christianity is not simply a matter of self-improvement, but of becoming something entirely different. This thought can be seen clearly in Mere Christianity." He's quoting here from Mere Christianity. "It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. When Eustace comes up out of the water, he has changed from a dragon into a boy, externally showing his alteration and literally exemplifying 2 Corinthians 5:17. Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation." This is a big deal. What's happening here? This is when, I think this is so important because I think this is one of the times where Lewis's nonfiction meets his children's literature here. And you see a lot of the things he's writing about, and it's so clear, like, oh, this is those ideas coming together in this story, and they're being communicated in this story.
Yeah.
And what are some of your thoughts as you hear some of these passages being read?
I think that as I was reading the story itself, I thought of my own times where I had tried to solve something all on my own, but it wasn't until you hand it over to Jesus that it's actually starting. It's not even that it got instantly taken away. It's that was the beginning of it actually starting. And we talk about this at the end of the passage too, where he has a few relapses. And he's still not perfect, but the journey has started. That process of him permanently being freed from this has begun. And so when I have passages like that confirm the fact that this is a metaphor for sin and being cleansed from that sin, it just makes me think, man, a lot of people recognize this too.
What is the importance of Eustace turning over on his back and letting Aslan be the one that really pulls this off?
I think he has fully realized that he cannot do this on his
Mm-hmm.
own. And so by lying on his back, he's submitting to the authority of Aslan in this case.
Yeah, I mean he's got his strong hide on his back. It's when he rolls over, he's got he's bearing his stomach, which is the much more softer part of him as a dragon, and he's kind of completely submitting to Aslan, and it's painful. And it's so good here that Lewis talks about how painful, or Eustace really talks about how painful it is for this to happen. That when he was doing it, it almost felt kind of good, right?
Yeah.
That he was, but when Aslan does it, it's painful. The pain is tremendous,
Yeah.
right? And that so often that is true. It really hurts to get rid of a lot of these things that need to be gone.
And to die to yourself in that way.
Yeah. And he's literally dying to himself as the dragon.
Yes.
Do you think this is Eustace's baptism?
I think when he gets into the water afterwards, that is his baptism. I think that the accepting Christ into your heart and the baptism are purposely separated in this story too. So Aslan begins working on him, and then he's baptized.
Well, as I was reading more about this idea of this pool as Eustace's baptism, I went back to the Keys to the Chronicles, and Marvin Hitton had written this, which I thought was so interesting. The garden holds a marble bath with a bubbling well at the bottom of it. According to the Didache, a valuable collection of apostolic practice dating from around the early 2nd century, early Christians preferred to baptize people in living water, meaning bubbly or running water, as opposed to the contemporary practice of still water in baptistries. The unusual feature of Aslan's baptistry, where living water comes up from a well rather than a spring as one might expect, issues from the biblical story of the Samaritan woman at the well, to whom Christ offers living water from a well of water springing up into everlasting life. And, although these are Hinton's thoughts on this text, I was really sold on this idea of this clearly being Eustace's baptism scene. And because I think for a long time as I read this, I wasn't always convinced that, this was necessarily a baptism, because again, these are supposals. They are not straight up allegories. And so in some ways I thought the idea that Eustace gets baptized and then becomes a good person was a little maybe too on the nose. And obviously that's also just not how things necessarily, you don't become baptized and then all of a sudden you're a great person. Mm-hmm. But reading this and thinking back to the church history of this idea of this bubbling water and stuff, I think that's more than just a coincidence. And I do think that Lewis wants us to imagine this as he is now baptized, he has been justified, if you will, and now the practice of sanctification begins. And then we clearly hear that this is Eustace, he has setbacks, he has slip-ups, he's not a perfect person after this. But I think, what's the word that Lewis used? I think he says the cure had been found or something like that.
He says the cure had begun.
Had begun, okay. So this story, any last thoughts on this story before we wrap it up?
I love the confirmation that Edmund gives Eustace. Eustace starts to think, maybe it was a dream. And Edmund goes, it wasn't a dream. And he points out the physical representation of the change. Mm-hmm. He's like, you're not a dragon anymore. And you have these new clothes on that you didn't have before. And I think that Edmund is playing a really critical role here. Having been someone, and everyone who has accepted Christ into their life for real is coming from a sinful past and will continue to sin, but it's different now that you have Christ on your side with that. But Edmund's role here is having gone through this process in a slightly different way, is now to affirm Eustace in his new transformation. And I love how he does it. And he points out things that Eustace is a little shaky on, like, was this a dream? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really critical, and I think it's a role that people need to recognize they need to play as people come to faith.
Yeah, and this begins to answer that question that we've had so far, which is, what is Edmund's role in this story? Right? He's clearly not the main character. Mm-hmm. That's Eustace for the most part. And the question we've had is, why do Edmund and Lucy get to come back and Peter and Susan not, right? Because it felt for us a little bit at the beginning, it's, Edmund and Lucy almost feel like an afterthought. Maybe they shouldn't have come back either. And I think here we're getting one of our answers. Edmund is here to kind of shepherd Eustace and to affirm this transformation happening within him. And what great progression this is, because literally 2 books ago, at this point in the story, Edmund was getting ready to betray his brothers and sisters to the White Witch. And so here we go, almost 2 books later, he's sitting here encouraging someone else like, yeah, this was real and you are changing, and that's a good thing. One other thing I wanted to mention right before Edmund encourages Eustace is the way that Eustace acknowledges that, he's back to his own body. He was so excited about his own arms. Right? He says, I was so happy to see my own arms. And he says this, I know they're no muscle and are pretty moldy compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. And it's a little silly. It's funny. But also, Eustace is acknowledging faults within himself, like a physical, I don't have very strong muscles. That's very different than Eustace, 3 chapters ago. He wouldn't have acknowledged something like this. He's saying, I was so happy to have my body back, even if, it's a little, weak and scrawny or something. And I think that just shows how he's already changed. He's acknowledging a fault within himself.
And even at the end of the chapter, when they're preparing to leave the island, he has no desire to go back and get more treasure. He doesn't have any of the treasure that he put in his pockets before he became a dragon.
Yeah.
And he knows there's more back there, but he and everyone else, they don't have any desire to go back.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
That indicates another real change for Eustace, too.
The chapter then kind of wraps up here. Caspian names the island Dragon Island, and they get ready to leave again. Lewis tells us that from that time forth, Eustace was a different boy. He wasn't perfect, but like you said, the cure had begun.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts about this chapter before we wrap our time up here?
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it's not referred to as a bracelet. It's an armband or arm ring. How do they say it at the beginning?
The arm ring. Yeah, hyphenated. Arm ring.
Arm ring, just like a lamp dash post. So Caspian takes it and he throws it up in the air. And then my understanding is he's throwing it up so that whoever catches it can keep it. Mm-hmm. But it gets stuck on a rock and they just leave it there. And it's probably still there to this day. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
I don't know. It might be a stretch, but I was making a connection to Galatians 2:20, right? So I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And this idea of like Eustace, he can't take anything with, and it's not him. It's not just him. It's Caspian and Lucy as well too. But they can't take any of these things from their past life with them. In order for them to leave Dragon Island, and especially Eustace, he has to leave behind his past. He can't even take a single bit of it with him. He has to die to himself. And so that was my thought. I kind of jumped straight to Galatians 2:20, which is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. And this idea like it has to stay. They can't even take a single small piece with them in order to, to move on. And it's mostly, I'm not sure how in this, this idea that I have, which is I'm just making up right now. I don't know how Lucy and Caspian fit into that, but it makes sense that Eustace can't take anything else with him, right?
Yeah. And I also, that bracelet has some real negative connotations to it, or just some negative associations, I guess would be a better way to say it. And I think it's good that no one takes it with them.
And I think that's why then Lewis says, like, for all he knows, it's still hanging there until the world ends. It's not being touched, and you can't go back. And why would you? Why would you want to go back?
Yeah. And why would you want it?
Yeah. It'd been all over this. I'm sure that Eustace sweated a lot as a dragon, right?
Yeah.
You don't
and
want
it's
that.
dried blood and everything.
It's
and
gross.
Dragon blood, too.
Yeah.
It's the worst kind. No offense.
It's okay. I don't think we have any dragon listeners. So before we wrap up, I just want to kind of bookend this and go back to this idea I mentioned about stories at the beginning of the chapter. I think we get those 3 instances throughout this chapter of stories being used to build up, to encourage, and just use for overall goodness, right? And I think Lewis is really trying to get us to understand how stories are beautiful and how they're good and how they can be good for our faith too. I mean, he was such a big proponent of this idea of the true myth, right? That the greatest story ever told is this in Scripture, and it happens to be true.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that he really is. He's almost like talking to readers that might be more like Eustace. He's like, engage with those stories, like lean into them.
Yeah.
Let them, seep into your heart and into your mind and respond to them. And I think that's one of the things that's been really sticking out to me is the beauty of stories.
Yeah. I mean, this is also an interesting thing to me because I've heard There's certain things that you hear in church all the time, and you just hear in Christian culture all the time. But this is presented in such a different way, it gets me to listen again. Because after a while, you can start to tune stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just another perspective because it's told through a story. And he's also talking about how you need stories to do stuff. And how Eustace wasn't able to tell a story because he hadn't read the right stories or read the right kind of books in this case. And I love that Lewis is saying they're important, but also providing a perfect example all in the same chapter.
Well, Phil, that wraps up our coverage here of chapter 7. And this is one of those chapters that we've ended this story. So, I mean, you have no idea what comes next.
No idea.
Because they just leave and we don't know anything else.
Yeah, I made sure that we had more chapters.
Oh, yeah, because you have the big book. So for all you know, it's the silver chair next or something.
Could be transitioning.
I mentioned before, Phil, that each island or place that they visit will kind of focus on a different character. So obviously these last 3 chapters on Dragon Island focused heavily on Eustace. Who do you think we're going to spend time with next?
I assume the rest of the crew. Maybe some Caspian in there.
Well, pick one person. Just
Caspian.
You think the next chapter or so will focus on some character development for Caspian?
Yes.
Cool.
Or maybe Reepicheep.
All right, cool.
I can't say anything money's else. On Caspian.
Great. Yeah, I can't say anything else. I can't spoil it, but we'll be back next time, though, with chapter 8. It's called 2 Narrow Escapes, and in that chapter, there are 2 narrow escapes.
Ooh.
Yeah, it's exciting, right?
Yeah.
But before we go, we do have some listener feedback.
Yes.
You want to do this one, Phil?
I do. This one is from Hannah. Hi, Phil and Daniel. I have been thoroughly enjoying your exploration of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader in Season 3, and looking forward to journeying with you through the rest of the book. I was recently talking to a friend about Prince Caspian, and she brought up the inclusion of the Greek and Roman figures that we find in this book. This then got me thinking why Lewis decided to include these figures, and Tolkien's On Fairy Stories jumped to my mind. In this essay, Tolkien talks about how all mythologies contain truth, as they are a reflection of the ultimate truth, the truth of God the Creator. As Lewis and Tolkien were friends and had many intellectual discussions, this inclusion of the characters by Lewis could be a nod to Tolkien's theory regarding the value of myths and the truth they hold. I am not a Lewis scholar, or even a Tolkien one, so I cannot say for certain if this is true, but I like it as a theory. Even if they aren't related, I love the idea that Tolkien explores in this essay, and would definitely recommend it. Thank you both for sharing your insights into this world I've come to wish was also my home, or at least I could be swept away to this magical land via wardrobe, horn, or painting. Further up and further in, Hannah. P.S. As there haven't been any wolves in Dawn Treader, there has been no mispronunciations, but I appreciate the effort all the same.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks for emailing us again, Hannah.
I do appreciate
We have been
that.
working on it with him in other conversations outside of the podcast.
Am I talking about, at the pause, am I talking about wolves outside of the
that's so
podcast?
good. Look how good you're getting.
I still have to catch my breath before I say it.
Yeah.
I'm so thankful for Hannah because I've been going about my entire life this way. It's embarrassing. I'm almost 30 and I'm just saying woofs all the time instead of wolves. So I think we can end the podcast at this point. We don't need to go on. I've learned how to pronounce that word. I realized recently.
That was actually the whole goal when we were talking about this. I thought, we could do another book, but this one has a lot of wolves.
Well,
it could really fix some speech problems that Daniel has.
Well, I realized this too. We were talking about this recently. It wasn't on the show or anything, but I had said for a long time, I'd said pajamas incorrectly. I was saying pajamas. Why did no one ever tell me this growing up?
It's not that pajamas is incorrect. It's just, it's way less common here.
No, I Googled it, and I couldn't find anyone saying...
You couldn't find anyone saying...
I watched a ton of YouTube videos of people saying the word pajamas. And I'm like, I'm the only person... Is it an accent? I don't think I have an accent.
The algorithm at YouTube thinks you're really weird now.
Yeah.
It's really into Star Wars, Narnia, scholarly articles, and pajamas.
And pajamas, that's right. Well, I picked this email this week, too, because it ties into what I've been saying throughout this episode, this idea of stories and myths and the fact that it's so beneficial to spend time in stories, because even stories that aren't, Christian in nature have elements of fact with them. That's what Tolkien is saying. All mythologies contain truth. I spend a lot of my time as an educator, someone who teaches ancient and medieval history. I teach about a lot of myths, and I really enjoy teaching myths, and it's so fun to then, with my students, sit down and be like, okay, so like it's a Christian school, so we'll sit down and we'll say, what are parts out of here that actually, let's compare this story, this creation story from India. Let's compare it to the biblical narrative, and let's talk through these things. And there's still many elements of truth in there, and it's so fun and so interesting because, like Tolkien says, all mythologies contain truth, and so we'll find elements of truth in all of these things, and they're able to actually point back to the ultimate truth, which is God. And I just really like this, and that's just been sticking out to me a lot. I know I sound like a broken record, and I don't know how exciting it is for listeners to hear me, but I'm really just excited about this. It's not my idea that I've come across, but just how much this idea of story and myth has been sticking out to me in Dawn Treader. I would have thought it would have been a different book, but this is the book that is.
It's curious that it's this one that it's sticking out.
And I'm reading. I just started reading when we were back at the symposium. I can't even remember the name of it, but I'll find it later and link it in the description. It's a book about Lewis and myth, and so I think that's just really sticking with me right now. But yeah, I could go on forever like this, but that's not what people want to hear.
Is it Bandersnatch?
No, Bandersnatch is Diana Glyer, and that's more about the relationship between the Inklings.
Okay.
I don't remember what it's called. I'll find it and I'll put it in the description. I've just been skimming it. I've not been reading it because you said, Phil, that when you read nonfiction, you don't have to read the whole thing. So
that's true. You're not required to finish a book.
I don't know if I'm kind of just skimming through it. I'm reading a lot of stuff right now, and so I've just been skimming through it when I'm free and stuff. And I like it a lot, and it's really making this stick out to me. But again, I can't remember the name of the book or the author. So, Oh, I got the name of it. It's The Fawn's Bookshelf: C.S. Lewis on Why Myth Matters. Oh, cool. It's by Charlie Starr. It's good so far. I'm really enjoying it.
That's a great title.
The Fawn's Bookshelf.
Yeah.
Do you know why it's called that?
Is man a myth?
Yeah, because Tumnus has that on his bookshelf, which is so fun. I love that.
So funny. It's what a great perspective where they're the myths.
Yeah,
and they have a book on whether or not we're real.
It reminds me. I know the movie's more famous, unfortunately, but have you ever read I Am Legend?
I have not read it.
It's like a little novella. It might even be a short story. It's only about like 100 pages or so, and it explores. The movie's more like a horror film kind of thing. But the book itself explores this idea of humans as kind of these legendary characters, more like a vampire would be, right? And it's really, it's 100 pages, a really quick read. And the exploration of this idea of humans as mythical creatures or as these legendary creatures is really interesting, and none of that made it into the movie.
Oh, yeah.
All the things that made the book good, not there. I mean, the movie's not awful, but... Yeah, any nuance or anything else. This is not the I Am Legend podcast, though. So maybe that's, when we finish the, that's what people are hungering for, right? After we're done with the Chronicles of Narnia, can you guys talk about I Am Legend?
Let's take it back to Will Smith's
2007. 2007. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. I haven't seen it since I saw it in theaters that one time.
That was the movie that everyone saw because it came out over Christmas when I got back on the bus. In either middle school or high school, whatever.
You had TVs on your bus?
No, when we came back, everybody
oh.
was able to talk about that movie. It appealed to everybody for some reason. Everyone had gone to see it, and I was able to talk amongst different social groups about the same movie. Yeah.
All I remember, besides not liking it, because I enjoyed the book better, which is kind of the story of my life.
Had you read the book before the movie came out?
I read it leading up to it. So I remember
Really?
watching, so I definitely saw like the trailer for it. I was like, that looks really cool. And because I'm impatient, I read the book.
Yeah.
And I remember being really disappointed when the movie came out. It has a lot of Bob Marley. Don't they? Isn't like Bob Marley? He's not in it, but don't they play Bob Marley?
That's when I started listening to Bob Marley because of that movie.
Really?
Yeah, I had no idea who he was before that. I was like, those are pretty good songs.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are obviously, it feels like we're doing dancing lawn stuff right now, just talking like this, but it's time to wrap up. So speaking of the dancing lawn, do you want to go ahead and do our end credits here?
Sure. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to Elias Dean, Stephen Page, and Madeline Heising for supporting us at the Care Paralevel level. Follow us into Narnia on our Twitter and Facebook pages. You can also send us feedback at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. We'd also love a review on Apple Podcasts. This helps other people find the show and join our read-through. Also, make sure you have subscribed to the show in your favorite podcast app so you can wake up to a new episode every other Wednesday. Thanks for coming along on this journey, and we will be back next time for Chapter 8.